And I should add also, I have a new book out this week that I'll talk a little bit about. It has a glowing rabbit on the cover, Second Nature. And so, yes, I've lived in New Orleans for about 11 years. I'm not a native, although my children are by rights. And I grew up in New York City, and I'm going to speak today not about the fiction, although Rachel said I write novels. My last novel was a historical novel called King Zeno, set in New Orleans 100 years ago, in part about the digging of the Industrial Canal and these axe murders that were happening at the time, and the birth of jazz. But I'm going to talk about the reporting that I've done in the last decade, mainly for the New York Times Magazine, where I'm a writer at large, and the work has tended to focus on environmental themes, which was not something that I necessarily sought out or realized I was doing at first, but I found myself being drawn over and over again to stories about, the dramatic transformation of the environment, of the planet. How did we get to this point? The strangeness of our current moment, where we're alive to both the incredible devastation of climate change and environmental damage all around us, as we are also aware of these really profound technological advances that are allowing people to think about more dramatic interventions in the natural world, perhaps for the better in the future. And so, one of the first stories I wrote on this theme, maybe the first, was a story about the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. And I should say, by the way, before I go into my talk, I think unless it gets too chaotic, but I don't think it would. If people have questions along the way, I think you're welcome to jump in or to type a message in the chat on the side of the Zoom. And I'm happy to take things as they come. But we'll have a formal time at the end also for questions if there are any. So yeah, one of the first pieces I wrote about was the Lower Ninth, and I reported the piece in about 2011 or 12. And what was going on then, that was getting some coverage in the local press, was this effort by Mayor Landrieu and the administration to try to clear the lots, which by then had grown, the abandoned lots in the neighborhood had grown out of control. There were once houses, there were now, trees that had grown up in just 5 or 6 years that were as tall as houses. And the citizens in the neighborhood, the residents, were really upset about this, understandably. And so that piece was about, both how did it get to that point, the danger and fear that people in the neighborhood had, and also, the city's failure to really articulate a vision for what to do in the future. Their strategy at the time was simply to send these groups of people in with, axes and lawnmowers to clear the lots. But they didn't really have any plan for what to do after that. But the other thing that was going on at that time, which was all equally fascinating to me, was that the Lower Ninth had become this sort of a place where scientists from all over the world who studied ecological disaster came to use it as a laboratory. Because what had happened in the Lower Ninth after Katrina was a full clearing of the landscape. The flood in parts of the neighborhood had wiped away not only properties, but also the natural flora, the wildlife that was there. And in the months that had followed, and years, what happened was this kind of biological feeding frenzy where species rushed into the void to recolonize it. And so you had this unusual, the word that was used by one of the scientists at Tulane was supernatural, which I felt was appropriate on a couple levels, reconfiguration of the landscape. So you had an unusual concentration, for instance, of birds of prey more hawks and owls and all kinds of birds of prey that you would not normally see even in a natural landscape. Rodents, you had all kinds of strange critters coming in from the swamp. You had exotic species, invasive species coming in, as well as native species. And so it became this kind of case study for what happens in the absence of total disaster, environmental disaster. And so that was going on at the same time. And that story for me, opened up some of these issues about both the eeriness of the moment and the human stakes in environmental damage. I did a similar story in Los Angeles. I was sent out to Porter Ranch, which is a wealthy neighborhood in North Los Angeles, where it's not really, the only way you would have ever heard of it or recognized it is it's the place where they shot E.T. And so if you want to picture it, it's these sort of large ranch houses up in the hills above LA. And for 3 months, a few years ago, it was the site of the world's biggest climate disaster in recent history. There were these mountains above the city that had been hollowed out and were used to store natural gas. And one of these wells was leaking. And so it was an invisible leak, and you couldn't see anything. And you couldn't really smell anything, although some people in the community thought that they could. And yet the amount of emissions that came out of this mountain over the course of 3 months before they could cap it was sort of like a Deepwater Horizon in the air situation. What the emissions were so great that there were more than just about every undeveloped country in the world while it was going on. So it was essentially I figured out it was a Lebanon's worth of emissions just coming from this one leaking pipe. But what was most interesting in my reporting was that the people in this community didn't really care about the climate aspect of it at all. They cared about, understandably, was whether they were getting sick from the gas. And although there was no evidence that the gas was making them sick, there was nothing in the gas that really could make them sick unless there were trace chemicals from the well's previous life as an oil container. It's still the anxiety that everybody felt in the community, or was felt to varying degrees in the community, really spoke to who the individuals were. And so it became the leak became a kind of mirror on the society, where people responded in the ways that people responded sort of gave one an insight into who they were and the lives they were and their own preoccupations. And so it was a kind of a mass panic that nobody could tell, whether what they were afraid of was really happening. And then the one thing that no one wanted to talk about or cared about was the climate impact, which was gargantuan. And so all of these stories, I had been doing a number of these stories, and my editors approached me a few years ago with a pretty unusual assignment. And this was the assignment that became the book Losing Earth. I wonder if I'll try to put an image up so you can see a little bit what I'm talking about. And so the Pulitzer Center, which is a journalistic foundation that's not really related to the Pulitzer Prize, but the same family supports it. They had created a partnership with the New York Times Magazine with the idea of publishing a whole article devoted to a whole issue devoted to a single article. And that had, there only been one other example in the history of the magazine, and really very few examples in the history of other magazines where a whole magazine was devoted to one story. And they wanted to publish a story about climate change. And so the question was, how do we, figure out what climate change story would be worthy of a story of that length? It's essentially was the length of a short book.
And what year was this?
This was, it was published in 2018, the final article, but I started researching it in, I think, 2016. Mm-hmm. And so it so what we decided on was this fascinating period in the history of climate change from 1979 to 1989. It's this 10-year period that was critical for a few reasons. One is that although the basic scientific understanding of climate change, at its most basic level, that the more carbon dioxide man puts into the atmosphere, the warmer the Earth will get over time. That understanding goes back to the 19th century. By the 1930s, by the end of the 19th century, you have a Swedish scientist, Arrhenius, who would win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, who understood that human beings, by burning coal, particularly was the main source then, were putting a lot of carbon up into the atmosphere, and that over time this would have a warming effect. Although being someone who lived in Sweden, he wasn't too concerned if the atmosphere got a little warmer. He thought that would be a good thing. And in the 1930s, you have a British scientist, Guy Callender, who did some math basically, and computed that in fact human beings by burning coal were increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere much faster than Arrhenius had realized. Still, Callender was not too concerned. He thought maybe London would be less, freezing in some number of decades. It wasn't until about 1957 when an very prominent American scientist named Roger Revelle, who's at UC San Diego, he and was an advisor to presidents, I think beginning with Kennedy, that he started to understand and started to grow concerned that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was growing so quickly. It had picked up even, much more. It spiked after World War II, that it was growing so quickly that the world would get warmer much sooner than scientists had thought. And furthermore, that the warming would be a bad thing, that this would not just mean that, life in cold weather capitals would be a little easier. What he understood was that all of our society, our infrastructure, the location of our cities, including obviously this one, where, how we trade internationally, how we grow our crops, the food production system, where our borders are, all of this was founded on the idea, essentially, the assumption that the global climate of the past would be roughly the same. The global climate of the future would be roughly the same as the past. And he understood that once the climatic conditions started to shift, even if it was gradual, even if it was over the course of decades, that this could have an enormously destabilizing effect on society, and could cause all kinds of problems. And he started to speak about this in the 50s. There was, in fact, a huge article in Life magazine about him at the time, that was sort of written in a kind of jocular tone, but was saying, predicting basically flooding of the world's major coastal cities and all of the rest that you sort of hear today, upending of the agricultural system, and sea level rise and so on. And he was an advisor to Lyndon Johnson as well. And in Lyndon Johnson, one of his first messages to Congress in 1965, he drafted this long memo about this question about, we need to keep an eye out for CO2 in the atmosphere, and we need to make sure that we're prepared for what's happening and see any ways that we can, combat it. And the science kind of kept continuing, kept progressing over the course of the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of work in the 70s. During the 70s, there was a competing fear that we might enter another ice age. And so for a few years, there was a sort of back and forth among some scientists about whether one effect might and that had to do with nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, whether also because of pollution. And there's some back and forth about whether the two effects would counteract each other. By the end of the 1970s, though, there's scientific consensus that the world is getting warmer, that this will have very dangerous effects on all levels of society, and that something needs to be done about it. If you read, and this was very, it's pretty shocking, shocking to me coming to this fresh when I first started this research, that there's really nothing that we know today that wasn't about climate change, that wasn't being articulated very clearly and precisely in 1979. And that's where the book begins. Everything that essentially everything we know, nearly everything we know today about climate change was known by 1979. And there wasn't really any dissent at the time, another unique thing. And there was an incredible amount of detail. It was understood, these effects, in incredible amount of detail. By 1989, to jump ahead to, this is the end where the book ends, we have essentially entered the political climate that we have today, where the issue has become a partisan issue, where right and left have different views and strongly held views about it, where there's a massive effort by oil and gas industry to stop any kind of meaningful climate policy from taking place. And you have the kind of political paralysis that we are still in today, more or less. I felt that story from 1989 to the present had been pretty well documented. There are a lot of books about all of this, about the politics, about the oil and gas industry's role in all of this. But what was not very well understood, or had been entirely forgotten by most people, it seemed, including people who followed this issue, was this period between 79 and 89 when the issue was not politicized. Prominent members of the Republican Party were calling for action on climate change. George H.W. Bush ran on it. It was one of a big plank of his 1988 campaign. And you had an incredible movement from 1979 to 89, in which a small group of people at first, scientists, policy members, really one activist, there was a single activist in environmental community who was involved in this issue at first, moved the issue along, and by the end of the decade had gotten to the precipice of a global solution, or what was seen as a global solution, which was an international treaty to curb carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that would be binding. And that was the first version of what, in its most recent version, is now the Paris Accord. It's part of the same process, the IPCC process, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had begun in 1989. But the first draft of this international treaty was actually a very strong binding agreement that the U.S. was going to lead on. Before going into slightly more detail about the trajectory of the book, I feel like I should pause in case anyone has any questions or want any clarification at this moment. Yes, ma'am, Carol, Miss Carol.
How do you explain when we're talking about getting overheated? I can understand that, but at the same time, you pick up the phone and talk to somebody in Colorado and they're having a freeze. I mean, how are these things going on in the same, we're practically neighbors because compared to what's going on around the world. And here, right here, 1,500 miles away, you've got a beautiful day like today, and you couldn't want nicer weather, but just around Easter time, I'm talking to my children who live outside of Denver, and they got their snow boots on.
Yeah, great
So
question.
how do you, I don't see where there's a problem except for the person who's suffering, who would rather be out at the beach
Right.
than shoveling his driveway.
Right. That's a good question. There are a couple issues you're hitting on there. The first is weather and local climate conditions in every place in the world. And of course, weather is what happens day to day, and will go up and down no matter what's happening with climate change. The danger of climate change, I think it's too often misconstrued as everyone's going to burn up. That's not what's happening. What's happening is a slow and incremental increase in temperature. So say in Colorado, I mean, I don't know what it's normally like this time of year, April 12th. Maybe the historical averages, just to put a number on it, are 50 degrees, on April 12th historically. Well, under climate change, all of a sudden, the normal temperature is 50.2 and then 50.5 and then 51 on April 12th. And that's an average. So every year it could be 60 or 40 or 70 or 30. But we're talking about very small increases in average temperatures. So any given day it could snow or be unusually cold or unusually hot. That's not going to change. It's just that when you average it all out, it's slightly higher. And we're at the point now, and in fact, in one of the major moments in the 1980s was by the end of the 1980s, for the first time, they could prove scientifically, they could prove statistically that average temperatures had increased by an observable amount. But at that point, it was maybe 0.1 degrees.
But that average temperature has to stay changed.
Right. So the average temperature does stay changed, and it has over these 30 years and will continue to increase. Now, you and I don't really feel it, right? If it's 1 degree or 2 degree or even 5 degrees warmer on one April day than it was 50 years ago, no one's going to notice that. But what will feel that are all of the plants and animals and furthermore and I'll get to sea level. I guess I can take that on separately. But what's not as well understood by people is that there are many species of animals and many aspects of ecosystems that have been habituated to living in a certain range. So to take the example of Colorado, the beautiful forests around Aspen, for instance, I wrote a story about this as well, are being destroyed by pine beetles. Okay. People who are living in Aspen don't really notice that it's necessarily warmer. They might know there's fewer days of snow than there used to be. It seems like things like that. The first day of snow is a bit later in the season than it used to be. But their day-to-day lives probably aren't dramatically affected yet. However, because temperatures have increased by a certain relatively small amount, these exotic pine beetles that bore into the barks of the trees have been able to live longer in their life cycle every year. And as a result, they're doing more damage every year. And so the kind of thing that you and I wouldn't notice year to year is actually having a devastating effect on forests in Aspen, around Aspen. I'm saying Aspen because I wrote a story about Aspen in particular, but this is happening all over the West. So you have, to take one example, you have this massive deforestation that's happening. Another example in Colorado is, where does Colorado get their drinking water from? It's largely from snow melt that goes into the streams, and then they pull it out, for in their reservoirs. Because the temperatures have been higher, there's less snow at the top of the mountains than there used to be. And when it melts, because spring is coming sooner, it melts much more quickly. And the result is that in the spring, the streams and rivers are much higher. And in the middle of the summer, they're much lower. And so they're having terrible drinking water issues all over Colorado and the West because of reduced levels of snowfall and reduced levels of water in the streams in the summer, because instead of the snow melting in a trickle over a period of months, it melts right away at the beginning of the season.
So our attitude has to be then that it's not, I could go put a coat on or I could put a bathing suit on, but it's 100 years from now, 200 years from now, what have we done to the planet? How have we left it? Essentially, it's about the future, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not so much about whether you're too hot, although of course there are parts of the world that are, you know, if you talk about sub-Saharan Africa, that it will be too hot to actually live in. But, you know, for most of us, especially in this country, it's not that we won't be able to live in Louisiana because it's too hot. It's that well, in our case, the sea will rise and we'll have more and more hurricanes and it'll be harder to live here. Or in Colorado, they won't have drinking water, or they won't have snow on the mountains, or they won't have forests, or the forest will be weakened by things like pine beetles, and there'll be much more forest fires. And so it's about undermining all of these systems that support us, right? Our civilization and how we live. And that's what Roger Revelle was worried about in the 1950s. Not that we're going to explode into flames. It's that where we've chosen to live and how we live are endangered by this. And so I think there's a great disservice in a lot of the language that we use around this, especially global warming. The problem is not for the globe, right? The globe will be fine. It's been much hotter in previous eras and much colder. And species have come and go and all the rest. The problem is for us. It's for human beings who are living on the planet in a certain way. And so I'll briefly go through the story because we're already. Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to make the point with regard to the coronavirus. Okay. So I'm a virologist and I've been studying viruses for many years. And it's very clear to me that the extent of the climate change warming up around the Chinese and Malaysia areas has led to the bats that live there to migrate further down. And so they are encountering new species. We don't know for sure if it's a pangolin, we don't know what animal it is, but for sure there is an intermediary species. And in the bat, we have all these coronaviruses. The bat is immune to them, of course, but they're constantly mutating and changing until they become more of a human species that, and I do believe that this coronavirus, when we finally understand it, and I hope not, but I predict future coronaviruses or other viruses like that will come out of this kind of a climate change warming situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you're right. It's something that, like all of these things, was well predicted in the late 1970s. They said, you know, increased epidemics as we both changed the range in which animals live in. And, you know, animals are moving with the temperatures, right? So it you know, as it gets warmer, they're changing where their habitats, and also, of course, as we develop into areas that are, you know, where bats or pangolins live and so on. And so this is like so many things with climate change. You can't say, well, COVID is because of climate change, but we know with climate change, the odds of a pandemic increase dramatically. And so in brief, the story of Losing Earth is about this handful of people, a NASA scientist, James Hansen, who in the early 80s starts studying the issue and publishes a major paper that ends up on the front page of the New York Times, warning of climate change, and even going sort of out of his element a little bit to say that we need to stop burning coal in order to you know, put off the greatest dangers here. And then this young policy wonk and activist named Rafe Pomerantz, who he helped to write the Clean Air Act in the 1970s. And he becomes aware of this issue by reading an article about this fascinating scientist named Gordon MacDonald, who like Revell was an advisor to just about every president, beginning with Kennedy. And he was this a CIA guy. He was essentially the head scientist for the intelligence agencies. He was part of this very secretive group of sort of superhero scientists convened by the government called the Jasons, which is its own fascinating story that I get into in the book. And they're tasked with dealing with any major national security issues from a scientific perspective. And so sometimes I was, developing bombs and things like that, but he also became fascinated with climate change and the risks that it would pose to national security. And this unlikely duo of this young activist and this seasoned intelligence scientist officer, they start to go around, starting in 1979 during the Carter administration, giving briefings on the issue to just about anyone who will listen. And they, in Congress, within the administration, they get up to Carter's own chief scientist, who signs the first in a series of major national reports on the matter. And so in this first part of the book, and in the first part of the history, you have a couple highly placed people who are very concerned about the issue. And they think, well, surely if we tell everybody what the problem is, some prudent leaders in the government will take some action. They soon find that doesn't quite work. You get a series of sort of bureaucratic meetings and no one really does anything. In the second part of the history, after there's sort of a pause when Reagan comes in and there's really, no progress at all on any environmental issues for some number of years, you have the emergence of the ozone hole, which is another national crisis where, a lot of people became terrified that there was a hole in the ozone layer and that the hole would cause, us to get skin cancer and even go blind. And there was a kind of mania and panic about this that led to a global treaty to phase out CFCs, which is the man-made chemical used in refrigeration and a number of other industrial applications, and was causing this depletion of ozone in the atmosphere. And it was a global treaty that Reagan championed, and it was the first global environmental treaty of its kind. And once it passed, it was seen by the people who were worried about global warming as the model for how to solve global environmental problems. And so by the time you get to the sort of late 80s, you have a way to solve it, a global treaty, and you have a bunch of people within the government, including a lot of top Republican senators and congressmen, who are pushing for the US to lead this global accord. By 1988, when you have Reagan saying that he's going to do it, as soon as after they signed the Montreal Protocol, the ozone treaty, said next time we get together like this, we're going to take on CO2. Okay, that's Reagan's administration in 1988. The next year, you have George H.W. Bush running to what today we would say is the left of Michael Dukakis on environmental issues, saying in a speech during an environmental tour of his campaign, those who are concerned about the greenhouse gas effect haven't heard about the White House effect. And when I'm in the White House, we're going to solve it. Bush is elected. And one of the first things he does is he invites the IPCC, this global climate group, to have its planning meetings at the State Department. And at the first meeting, James Baker, who's newly installed as Secretary of State, gives a speech welcoming them to the meeting, saying the U.S. is going to lead on climate change and we're going to solve this problem. And in the final part of the book, which plays out over 88 and 89, you have the emergence for the first time of a antagonistic force to all of this, and it's embodied by this John Sununu, former governor of New Hampshire, who was a PhD scientist in a previous career, and is George H.W.'s chief of staff. And he develops his own theories about this. He becomes very skeptical about climate change, and even more skeptical about governments using climate change to pass laws that might have any kind of damaging effect on industries. And so this is the real beginning of when you start to hear this is bad for business, that if we pass some of these laws to reduce emissions, it'll be bad for the economy. And that maybe the problem's not as bad as the scientists are saying it is. That's the first time you have that coming. And that's at the end of 88, 89. And the culmination of the history is in this meeting in the Netherlands, the first high-level diplomatic meeting on climate, where because John Sununu doesn't trust the head of Bush's EPA, who's very strongly in support of a climate agreement, he sends his own advisor to go with him. And at the last moment, the US delegation thwarts the effort to proceed on this global agreement. And in retrospect, that's the closest we've come ever since, because shortly after that, the oil and gas industry mobilizes and develops a strategy to try to stop climate action. And I write about that in depth as well, that what was happening in 89 and at Exxon and at the American Petroleum Institute in response to this massive push for a climate treaty. And we get to where we are today. And so that's the story of Losing Earth in brief. And I've put the cover jacket. And we just about have to go to questions, I believe, but briefly before we do that, I'll just give you a little description of my new book, which is just out last week, called Second Nature. And it includes stories like the ones about the lower ninth and Los Angeles. And it's structured, it's not about climate change specifically, although climate change factors into it, but it's a more broad look at the ways in which our natural world has been reconfigured and how people are responding to it, and how some people are trying to figure out ways to use our most advanced technologies, things like genetic engineering or land building, as you see in the Louisiana coast right now, using the Mississippi to create new land to rebuild the coast. That's a major part of the book. Ways in which to use technology to restore what's been lost, or at least bring back elements, that we feel have been lost, if not in the same form, then functioning the same way. So to give a couple of brief examples, there's an effort called de-extinction, where scientists are trying to use genetic engineering to recreate species like the passenger pigeon or the woolly mammoth, famously, that have gone extinct, and trying to bring them back to repopulate the earth. There's a story about an effort by this company, and it's a whole industry really, and this company I wrote about is in Northern California, that is creating chicken by culturing cells from a living chicken, and then in a lab basically producing chicken nuggets, chicken breasts, any steaks also in the future. And the idea, as grotesque as it sounds, and frankly disgusting, the idea is essentially to be able one day to mass produce meat products without killing any animals, because they take a scrap of a cell from a living animal, and then in the lab grow it and until it becomes, you can chop it up into whatever form you want. And so there, some of these ideas that I write about seem totally crazy. And then as you go down as you understand it more, they become less and less crazy. I mean, the chicken example is a good one, where, we think it's so unnatural to be creating a chicken in a lab. And of course it is, but there's nothing natural about the chicken industry and how we mass produce these birds and breed them to be in a certain shape and to taste a certain way. And if you go even further back, the chicken is a human-made creation. These were once jungle fowl living in jungles that didn't barely resemble what we think of today as domesticated chickens, that over time were bred to be the creature that we eat today. You could say the same thing about cows and pigs for that matter. And so the book is about, people coming to terms with the strangeness and the devastation that we've done as a species, and also trying to use some of these technological powers for good and not recklessly. So I'm happy to talk about any of that further if you're interested, or anything else on your mind that you'd like to discuss. This is your time. Oh, and remember to take yourself off mute. I think I see someone speaking.
Yeah. Can I ask another point?
Yes.
Yeah. So there is a very interesting book. I'm sure you're aware of it. It's called Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yes.
And for those in the call who haven't read it, I just want to bring up the first aspect of it. It deals with a futuristic view of what happens when things in the earth, in India in particular, get too hot. But the point I wanted to ask you about was then the Indian, if you will, armed forces, not armed forces, but the Air Force decides to do what's called a double Pinatubo. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
To a volcano to help cool.
Yeah. So the idea is
eruption.
that they would spew into the air to try to cool things down. Some kind of whatever it is. So the point I'm trying to make is, what do you think about these ideas that there are? Maybe is there real efforts? I know there was, just recently they canceled it, right? That the effort to put into the air some kind of reflective particles. So I just want your thoughts on those kinds of, futuristic things.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so you're talking about what tends to be called geoengineering, and one of the most fascinating figures I spoke to in Losing Earth, Wallace Broker, who died in the last year or so. He was credited with coining the term global warming, I believe, in the mid 70s. Was a very prominent scientist at Columbia, and often testified before Congress. Most people are sort of terrified by the idea of a lot of these geoengineering ideas, and essentially, for those who aren't familiar with it, it tends to be some version of emitting some huge quantity of gas into the atmosphere, not carbon emissions, but some other kind of gas that usually nitrous oxide, I believe, or sort of sulfuric compounds that essentially dim the sun. They serve that while they're in the atmosphere, they block the sunlight, and this is what is observed when a volcano erupts. It's actually how James Hansen, who I wrote about, how he got his start in this with Mount Pinatubo, in fact, explicitly, when he noticed that globally the stars shone less bright for a year or so after the eruption, because there was all of this dust in the atmosphere. And so the idea is if things get too out of hand, we'll have to put up artificial volcanic eruptions, essentially. And there's a lot that can go wrong. There's a ton that could go wrong, and it could be disastrous in a lot of different ways. But we're increasingly at the point when we fail to stop burning, fossil fuels, where you have to start taking these things seriously. At a certain point, you get past a point of no return when you have to consider even the most radical ideas. And Wallace Broker was one who really felt that we were not studying it enough, that the government doesn't fund this research, or hasn't to this point. And so his argument was yes, this is full of danger and it could be a disaster, but we have to at least study it. We have to consider it and understand what is possible. And there are lots of versions of it. There's also, another version of it is creating these machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere that as of now is totally cost ineffective, but one can imagine, a day in which the technology advances. So I think the broader point here is that, and this is what I write about in Second Nature, is, we're now getting to the place where a lot of serious people are engaging with ideas that until now have seemed totally absurd, because the desperation is and the damage is getting that far. And so I think it's increasingly, we're entering into this sort of science fiction reality that we're not really prepared for culturally, but it's where the science is going.
So, Nathaniel, my name is Chuck Holman. I've got a question for you regarding your opinion as to where we go from here, how you see the future with climate change and what sort of changes we can make and what their effect will be.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about climate change is that for as complicated as it is, and for its largest scale a problem as it is, the solution is actually pretty simple. It's burn fewer carbon, burn less fossil fuel is really the main issue here. There are other major contributors. I mean, the one of the main arguments for instance, for the chicken company I write about, for reducing our reliance on factory farms, is they have an enormous amount of carbon emissions. In fact, I think in the US and in some of more advanced Western societies, because we've done a pretty good job of reducing, coal burning, which is by far the biggest source of carbon emissions and among the fossil fuels, that our carbon footprint, I think, might at this point even be more from animal agriculture than from oil and gas. And yet, it's essentially about reducing emissions. So however we can reduce emissions helps. It's a cumulative problem. And so then you get into, well, what are the ways to do so? Again, the answers have sort of been there from the beginning. This is things that Rafe Pomerantz, who's the hero of Losing Earth, was talking about in 1980. Increase funding of renewable energy sources so that market could advance even more quickly than it is, although it's advancing much more quickly than I think most experts thought. It means phasing out coal and oil and gas as quickly as possible. Obviously, that's a touchy subject in Louisiana, although we also have enormous capacity for offshore wind energy and solar energy. It's just not being utilized, although that's changing. And it means helping developing countries who we know from projections that as they develop, will require just enormous amounts of energy. And so in a place like India, say, or even China as its own example, unique example, we have to help those countries as they develop, not rely on coal and oil and gas, but use renewable energies to get there, because we know these places, they need to modernize, right? We're talking about issues like poverty and disease, and you need energy to fix a lot of these problems at a basic level. And so how do you help those countries along without destroying the global atmosphere? So those are all main elements of it. And of course, there's political questions about how you do all of that. And that's always the source of debate. But until now, the political debate has been hampered because you have one party that's official position is that this isn't even happening. So there's a lot of work to be done politically before we can have a more reasonable arguments about policy, which I think are still ahead of us.
So when it comes to the atmosphere right now, I believe the carbon content is around 400 parts per million. Do you see
420 as of this week? Sorry, go ahead.
Do you see an upper limit as to what the carbon parts per million would be before we reach a tipping point?
Yeah, I think you could argue we're past the tipping point, and in which that the tipping point was reached essentially by the end of the 1980s, to the point where we're noticing changes in our daily lives in the record of the temperature record. However, and this is a really important point that I think you're touching on, is that when it comes to climate, it's not a binary situation. We're worse off. The best case scenario ahead of us now is certainly much worse than it was in 1989. More carbon has been emitted to the atmosphere since 1989 than the entire history of human civilization up to 1989, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. However, that doesn't mean that we should give up and sort of just welcome the worst case scenario. We still have a really wide range of outcomes available to us. And so it's a spectrum. And so, scientists have been talking about at the IPCC, for instance, it's, how do you avoid 2 degrees Celsius warming? It's probably too late realistically to avoid 2 degrees Celsius warming. But there's a huge difference between 2.1 Celsius warming and 2.2 Celsius warming, and between 2.2 and 2.5, and so there's still this huge range of outcomes available, and it's an incremental problem with incremental solutions. And I think that's a hard point to rally around, sort of, publicly. People want to know, it's a lot easier to talk about victory and defeat. And this goes for the activists as well as politicians. But the honest answer is that the more we do, the sooner we do it, the better off we'll be. And as far as a worst case scenario, it gets into, just completely uninhabitability of the planet for human beings is there. But before we get to that, there's a lot of other scenarios we want to avoid on the way.
Okay, one last thing. I'm a geologist by trade, retired, and there is a natural process of the rise and fall of the oceans. And has anybody you've encountered in your research and work been able to separate mathematically the effect of human beings on the climate with carbon emissions vis-a-vis the natural cycle of rise and fall of the oceans?
Yeah, yes, I think that's well established. I think what's like so many things with climate change, it's not that we're going into places that the Earth has never been before. That the waters have been much higher before and lower. We've had ice ages and so on, and we've had periods of time where there's no ice on the planet. The danger is really for our species and how our society operates and the rate at which it's happening. So things that would have taken tens of millions of years are happening within decades. And when you have that, even if we can't, even if it's not a big deal to one, an individual, whether it's 3 degrees warmer or 10 degrees warmer 1 year versus 5 decades ago, the effects of that on the natural processes of the planet are gargantuan, and including on the oceans. I mean, most dramatically in some ways on the oceans. And so that's why you have, and just a brief note about sea level rise. It's not just melting, ice caps and glaciers. It's also the water itself expanding as it heats up. And so you have this rise in sea level that, again, we're talking about millimeters a year globally. And yet when you have a city like New Orleans, perched on the Gulf, protected by these marshes that are also, dying, and you have increased storm activity, it might be the difference between inhabiting New Orleans in 50 years and not, or New Orleans being an island in the middle of the Gulf, as a Tulane scientist just told me it would be in about 75 years, barring any dramatic change. And so, these incremental tiny effects can have major effects on the way we live. And that's the concern is you know, effect on our species and other species that share the planet with us more than the effect on, you know, the globe, as it were.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nathaniel, just a point about what we were talking about, the oceans and the seas. There was a wonderful video that was shown in the New York Times of these whales trying to escape these fishing vessels. They kind of put like a little red monitor on it. Did you see it at all?
I think my wife was telling me about it, but I haven't seen it yet.
It's incredible. It just shows trying to just survive the species of whales in the South China Sea or somewhere off the coast there to escape these fishing vessels that are not trying to hunt the whales, but just trying to fish. There are so many that have increased in that ocean that they're barely able to survive at all. So, you know, that's just another component.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, can you touch on the impact of the global warming on the snow melt, the shifting of all that weight into the ocean and the wobbling of the planet, maintaining our position in the orbit? Is that a concern?
I don't think that is a concern. I think it balances out. I would refer to the geologist about the details of that, I suppose. But I think that's less of a concern. Now, of course, like the position of the Earth relative to the sun and the sort of natural wobbling that occurs does have effects on climate but that I think balances out over time. And you know, we do have naturally periods of ice ages and not, but the forcing effect is what climate scientists say. The forcing effect of global warming overcomes those natural variations quite dramatically, certainly over a course of decades.
I can't think of the term. What is that called? That shifting of the weight?
Now, yeah, you're putting the screws on me now.
Right.
No
pressure.
It's this something effect. Yes, the wall you're talking about.
We're getting all that weight moving from land.
Well, I don't think it's caused by the weight of snow melt, though. That's a separate issue. There's a natural shift on the axis of the planet as it orbits the sun, and it goes through.
That's probably precession.
Precession. There we go.
And then there's also Chandler wobble, which is a subset of the precession of the Earth.
There we go. Dr. Holman with the save. Thank you.
Wobble in its axis. Right now it's at 23.5 degrees, but it can vary between 25 and 21. It's like a spinning top losing its velocity.
There, much better than I could have come up with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions or comments? All right then. This was so interesting. Thank you so much for joining us and bringing this topic to our attention yet again. And we had a nice group who really had a lot to offer alongside it.
Yes, thank you all for showing up, and I'm sorry that we couldn't do it in person, but perhaps on another occasion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's hope that's all it is. All right, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.